you know Egypt. You know the pyramids rising from the desert. You know the pharaohs, the gods, the golden masks. You know the names: Ramesses, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra. You have known them since you were a child. Egypt is one of the most recognized civilizations in the history of the world. So here is a question that almost no one asks. Who conquered Egypt? Not invaded, not raided, not threatened at the border. Conquered. Who sent an army north along the Nile, captured Memphis, united the two crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, and ruled as pharaoh over one of the most ancient, enduring, and recognizable civilizations the world had ever known? The answer is not a name most people recognize. The answer is a kingdom. And that kingdom rose not from the north, not from the east, not from the sea, but from the south, from the deep Nile Valley, from a land that Egypt had once called a frontier, a buffer, a source of gold and ivory and soldiers to be absorbed and forgotten. The kingdom was called Kush. And this is where the story becomes strange, because Kush did not simply conquer Egypt. Kush absorbed Egypt's sacred language of kingship, its crowns, its gods, its temples, its rituals, and then spoke that language with a Nubian voice. The kings of Kush built and restored monuments across Egypt. They presented themselves not as foreign rulers, but as the true custodians of a tradition that Egypt's own rulers had allowed to erode. In Kushite royal ideology, and in the sacred language they used at Thebes and Memphis, they were not merely conquerors. They were restorers. And then, when the Assyrian Empire drove them back south, when Egypt slipped from their hands, Kush continued. That is the part that surprises people. Kush did not end when it lost Egypt. It moved its capital further south, into the deep Sudan. It built cities and temples and trade routes. It smelted iron. It sent merchants across the ancient world. Over the centuries, it produced queens and royal women who commanded armies, negotiated with Rome, and sometimes ruled in their own right. It developed its own script to write its own language. Across Sudan and Nubia, its pyramid fields came to outnumber Egypt's. And then, gradually, it faded. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophe that history recorded and remembered. It weakened under pressures: climate, internal fracture, the rise of a new kingdom from the south, and dissolved quietly into the landscapes and successor cultures of the Middle Nile. What was left was silence, and in that silence, for a very long time, almost nothing. The pyramids stood, the inscriptions remained. But the language carved into those stones, Kush's own script, its own voice, its own record of itself, could not be read. And even now, though we have learned to sound out its letters, much of what it says still waits to be understood. This is the story of a civilization remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a footnote to Egypt. A kingdom seen, when it is seen at all, through the longer shadow of its more famous neighbor. But Kush was not a footnote. It was one of the great Nile civilizations, one of the longest-lasting kingdoms in the ancient world. A civilization that did not merely exist alongside Egypt, but outlived the very meaning of Egypt. Settle in. This journey takes a while. To understand Kush, you have to go further back than the conquest of Egypt. You have to go back to a place called Kerma. Kerma sits near the third cataract of the Nile. a point where the river breaks over rock and becomes fast and churning and impassable by boat. It is in what is now northern Sudan, and by around 2,500 years before the Common Era, something remarkable was already happening there. A city was rising. Not a village, not a seasonal settlement. A city with a monumental temple at its center built from mud brick, with workshops and palaces spreading outward from that core, with a harbor on the Nile where goods arrived from deep in Africa and departed north toward Egypt. The Egyptians knew it was there. They traded with it. They feared it. They called the land Kush, which may have been the indigenous name for the kingdom itself. At its height, Kerma controlled a long stretch of the Nile south of Egypt, reaching deep into Upper Nubia and rivaling Egypt's southern power. Its army was built around archers whose skill the Egyptians respected and documented. It built networks of contact and exchange with distant powers, and at one critical moment, those networks became something more. When Egypt fractured during its second intermediate period, with the Hyksos ruling in the north, Kerma saw an opportunity. The evidence comes from the Kamose texts, Egyptian royal inscriptions preserved through the Carnarvon tablet tradition, in which a message from the Hyksos ruler to Kush appears as intercepted correspondence. It is worth remembering that this is Egyptian royal propaganda, written to make Kamose look like a king surrounded by enemies and determined to save his people. But even read with that caution, the texts point to contact, perhaps even attempted coordination, between Egypt's northern and southern enemies. Two powers were not acting in complete isolation from one another. Egypt survived that pressure, but only just. When the Egyptian New Kingdom rose in the 16th century before the Common Era, it struck back hard. Campaigns moved south under pharaoh after pharaoh. Kerma was eventually absorbed into Egypt's imperial reach, its independence extinguished, its people governed by Egyptian administrators who built temples to Egyptian gods and expected the Nile Valley south of the First Cataract to behave as a province, not a civilization. For centuries, Egyptian temples, officials, and inscriptions covered the southern Nile with the language of empire. But beneath that imperial layer, the older memory of the land did not disappear. It waited. And here is where something interesting happened, not in the ancient world, but in the modern one. When archaeologists first arrived at the ruins of Kerma in the early 20th century, they brought with them a set of assumptions. The most influential of them was a Harvard Egyptologist named George Reisner. He looked at what had been built there, the scale of it, the complexity of it, and concluded that it could not be indigenous. It had to be Egyptian, an outpost, a colony, evidence that the people of this region had never, in his words, developed any trade or industry worthy of mention on their own. He was wrong. It took decades for that error to be corrected. The work that finally dismantled it came from a Swiss archaeologist named Charles Bonnet, who spent the better part of 30 years excavating at Kerma and in the surrounding Nile Valley. What he uncovered was not an Egyptian colony. It was a capital city. Bonnet found the foundations of houses, workshops, and palaces dating back as far as 2,000 years before the Common Era. A large urban center that had been building itself up independently for centuries before Egypt extended its reach south. He found a monumental mud brick temple, known today as the Western Dafufa, that stood at the heart of the city and served a religious function that was distinctly not Egyptian. He found craft production, local traditions, a material culture with its own logic and its own aesthetic. He found Sudan in Sudan. Western archaeologists, Bonnie later said, were trying to find Egypt in Sudan, not Sudan in Sudan. The Eastern Cemetery confirmed the scale of what had been missed. Lying a few miles from the city, it served as the burial ground for Kerma's rulers for close to 1,000 years. It contains over 30,000 tombs. Some of the largest are covered with great earthen mounds and encircled with the skulls of cattle, markers of wealth and ritual power. Inside the most elaborate tombs, alongside the buried rulers, archaeologists found the remains of human sacrifice. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals interred in the same moment, suggesting ceremonies of extraordinary scale and social organization. This was not a peripheral place. This was a kingdom. What connected Kerma to the later kingdom of Kush is not entirely clear. There is a gap in the record, several centuries during which Egypt controlled the region and suppressed or transformed what had existed before. But the memory of Kerma did not vanish entirely. When later Kushite kings established themselves at Napata, royal statues of Kushite pharaohs were deposited near the old, sacred landscape of Kerma, a gesture suggesting the old place still mattered, even as the royal cemeteries had long since moved elsewhere. Whether the Kushite kings of Napata were direct descendants of Kerma's rulers, or whether they were a later dynasty that consciously claimed that legacy, is a question scholarship has not fully resolved. What is clear is that when Kush emerged as an independent kingdom around the 11th century before the Common Era, once Egypt's new kingdom had weakened and its grip on the south had loosened, it did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a Nile valley that had been building civilization for over 1,000 years before anyone outside it paid much attention. By around 900 years before the Common Era, the kings of Kush were ruling from Napata, a city near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. And Jebel Barkal was not simply a beautiful landmark. It was a sacred hinge between two worlds. The Egyptians themselves had believed the mountain was a dwelling of the god Amun, the great creator deity of the Nile Valley, the divine force behind legitimate kingship. Egypt had built a temple at its base. And when Egyptian power receded from the south, the Kushites did not simply inherit that temple, they claimed it. This was not imitation. The Kushites were not borrowing Egypt's god out of admiration or deference. They were making a theological statement that Amun's true home was here, in the deep south, at Jebel Barkal, and that the kings who ruled from its shadow were the god's rightful representatives on earth. Egypt had looked south and seen a frontier. Kush looked at the same mountain and saw a throne. In the centuries that followed, Kushite kings would mark royal burials with pyramids, smaller and steeper than the Egyptian monuments, but unmistakably chosen as a statement of inheritance and legitimacy. They were not copying Egypt out of admiration alone. They were making a claim. And in time, that claim would become something the world had not seen before. A kingdom from the south, from the deep Nile, from the land Egypt had once called a frontier, would march north, take the throne, and rule as pharaoh over the civilization that had shaped the Nile world for 2,000 years. But that comes next. By the 8th century before the Common Era, Egypt was not the power it had once been. The great empire that had built Karnak and Abu Simbel, that had fought the Hittites to a standstill and traded with the known edges of the world, had fractured. The north was controlled by a series of Libyan-descended rulers who squabbled among themselves and let the temples fall into disrepair. The south centered on Thebes, the old religious heart of Egypt, where the priests of Amun still held enormous influence, but no single ruler held the country together. Egypt was divided, and it had been divided for a long time. From Napata, the kings of Kush watched. They had been watching for generations. They had built their own temples to Amun at Jebel Barkal. They had deepened their own connection to the religious traditions that Egypt's own rulers seemed to be allowing to erode. In the eyes of the Kushite kings, the situation in the north was not simply a political problem. It was a religious one. The god was being neglected. The sacred order was breaking down. Someone had to restore it. But before an army moved north, something else happened first. Something quieter and, in some ways, more significant. The Kushite king Kashta had a daughter named Amenirtis, and Kashta arranged for her to be adopted into one of the most powerful religious offices in Egypt, God's wife of Amun. The title sounds ceremonial. It was not. In Thebes, the god's wife of Amun controlled vast temple estates, substantial economic resources, and ritual authority that placed her between the god and the king. The adoption of a Kushite princess into that office made Kushite rule in Thebes legitimate, not through force, not through conquest, but through the sacred machinery that Egypt itself had built. Before PHARAOH marched north with an army, Kushite power had already stepped into Thebes through ritual, family, and the god whose name they shared. The road to Memphis began, in part, at Thebes, not with a siege engine, but with a Kushite priestess princess whose office gave Nubian power a sacred foothold inside Egypt itself. What Kashta began through sacred legitimacy, his son PHARAOH would complete through military force. PHARAOH's campaign north is documented in a way that almost nothing else from this period is, because PHARAOH had it recorded in his own royal voice, on a large stone stele that survived and that archaeologists recovered and translated. The victory stela is one of the most detailed accounts of military and political events from the ancient Nile world. But we must read it knowing what it is. This is PHARAOH's royal self-presentation, vivid, detailed, and written to glorify the king who commissioned it. With that understood, it is still extraordinary. PHARAOH describes his march north, his capture of city after city, his arrival at Memphis. He describes how his soldiers purified themselves with water from the Nile before battle, how he insisted they dress in fine linen, how he visited the temples not as a conqueror, but as a devotee, pausing his military campaign to present offerings to the gods before continuing. He was not behaving like an invader. He was behaving like a pharaoh, restoring order to his own kingdom. And when the northern rulers came before him, one by one, and submitted, PHARAOH made a point that has since struck historians as remarkable. He allowed them to approach him only after they had purified themselves. Those who had eaten fish, considered ritually impure, were not permitted to enter his presence at all. Egypt's new ruler was more traditionally pharaonic, in certain respects, than the rulers he had just defeated. PHARAOH returned to Napata after his victory without consolidating full control over all of Egypt. That work fell to his successor, Shabaka, also rendered Shabako in some sources, who established his Egyptian royal seat at Memphis and imposed firm control over the entire country. Upper and Lower Egypt, the Delta, and the Deep South united under a single throne for the first time in generations. All the while, Napata remained what it had always been, the spiritual homeland, the seat of Amun, the sacred center from which Kushite kingship drew its deepest authority. Memphis was where Egypt was ruled. Jebel Barkal was where kingship itself was rooted. Shabaka is remembered for the Shabaka stone, a monument carved with the Memphite theology, a creation text centered on the god Ptah. The inscription claims to preserve an older, worm-eaten document at risk of being lost. Scholars today treat that rescue story as a rhetorical device, a piece of royal ideology, rather than a straightforward account of archival preservation. But the message it carries is clear regardless. A Kushite pharaoh was presenting himself as the guardian of Egypt's most ancient sacred wisdom. Not an outsider, not an occupier, a custodian. The dynasty that followed, what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty, ruled Egypt for nearly a century. At its height, it controlled one of the largest and most symbolically powerful states of its age, a Nile empire stretching from the Sixth Cataract to the Mediterranean. THUNDERCLAP was the dynasty's most ambitious builder. He restored temples across Egypt, added a great colonnade to the Temple of Karnak, and built extensively in his Nubian homeland. Biblical tradition remembers him as Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, a reference that places THUNDERCLAP in the world's wider geopolitical memory, at a moment when two of the most powerful states of the ancient Near East were in collision. Because that was the problem that would end everything. The Assyrian Empire, centered in what is now northern Iraq, was the most formidable military force the ancient world had yet produced. It was expanding west and south, conquering kingdoms, destroying cities, resettling populations. It had already dismantled Israel. It was pressing into the Levant, toward Egypt's northeastern border. THUNDERCLAP fought them. He sent forces in support of those resisting Assyrian expansion. He held them back for a time, but the Assyrians came anyway. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt in 671 before the Common Era. He took Memphis. He drove THUNDERCLAP south. THUNDERCLAP returned and retook Memphis after Esarhaddon's death. But the next Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, came again, more decisively. THUNDERCLAP was driven from Egypt permanently, back to Napata. His successor, Tanutamani, made one final attempt to retake Egypt, and briefly succeeded in the south before Ashurbanipal's forces pushed him back as well. By around 656 before the Common Era, the 25th dynasty was over. Egypt would pass to a new native Egyptian dynasty, then to the Persians, then the Greeks, then Rome. The Kushites were gone from the throne of the pharaohs. But Assyria was not the last northern power to reach toward Kush. Decades after the expulsion, an Egyptian pharaoh of the Saite 26th dynasty, Psamtik II, sent his own army south against Kush. The campaign, in around 593 before the Common Era, struck deep into Nubian territory. Ancient sources and archaeological evidence indicate his forces reached Napata, looting its temples and destroying royal monuments. The sacred city at the foot of Jebel Barkal was no longer beyond danger. That campaign was one pressure among several, alongside the pull of trade routes, agricultural land, iron resources, and burial traditions gradually rooting themselves further south, that over the following generations drew Kush's center of gravity away from Napata, toward Meroë. This is where, in most accounts, the story of Kush effectively ends. The conquest is described, the dynasty is catalogued, and then the chapter closes, and Egypt moves on, and Kush becomes a footnote, a remarkable episode, a curiosity, a brief interruption before the more familiar narrative resumes. But that framing gets something important wrong. Kush did not end in 656 before the Common Era. The same royal line that had ruled Egypt, the same dynasty, the same tradition, the same claim to divine authority, returned to Napata and continued, not as a diminished remnant, not in mourning for what had been lost, but as a kingdom with its own identity, its own trajectory, its own future. What came next was not decline. It was transformation. And the most extraordinary chapter of Kush's story was still ahead. When the Kushite kings left Egypt, they did not disappear. They went home. Home was Napata, in the shadow of Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain, the dwelling of Amun, the place where Kushite kings had built their temples and anchored their claim to legitimate rule. For a time, they continued from there. But Napata had been shown to be vulnerable. Forces from the north had struck the city directly, looting its temples, destroying royal monuments. And alongside that vulnerability, the pull of the south was growing. Richer iron deposits, more productive agricultural land, trade routes that converged further down the Nile. These forces together, over generations, drew Kush's center southward. Further south, further into Africa, toward a city on the eastern bank of the Nile called Meroë. The move was gradual, spanning generations, and its full causes remain debated among scholars. But the direction was clear. By around the 4th century before the Common Era, Meroë had become the primary seat of Kushite power. And what was built there over the next several centuries was extraordinary. Meroë sat at one of the most strategically significant points in the ancient world. The Nile curved near it, caravan routes converged on it, and the land around it held what the ancient world always needed most: metal. Iron ore in the ground, hardwood forests to fuel the furnaces, and the knowledge passed down through generations of craftsmen to turn raw material into tools and weapons and trade goods. The slag heaps left behind by Meroë's iron production are among the largest in the ancient world. Older historians sometimes called Meroë the Birmingham of Africa, a phrase modern scholars use cautiously because the full scale and organization of that production is still being studied. But the reason the comparison exists is real. Iron was central to Meroë's economy, and its reach extended far beyond the city itself. And iron was not the only thing moving through Meroë. The city sat at the intersection of routes connecting the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa, the Red Sea coast to the deep interior of the continent. Ivory came through Meroë. Gold came through Meroë. Ebony, incense, textiles, fine ceramics. The material culture of Meroitic life reflected a city in active contact with the wider ancient world. Mediterranean wine vessels have been found in Meroitic graves. Egyptian-style objects sit alongside distinctly Kushite goldwork. Bronze, iron tools, and locally produced pottery show a city that was making things, trading things, and absorbing influences from multiple directions at once. This was not a kingdom at the edge of the world. This was a hub. Rome knew this city existed. Rome cared about this city, which is how we arrive at one of the most remarkable stories in the history of the ancient Nile. In the year 30 before the Common Era, Rome conquered Egypt. Augustus Caesar absorbed the last Ptolemaic kingdom into the empire, made Egypt a Roman province, and stationed garrisons along the Nile. The southernmost Roman outpost was at a city called Syene, near what is now Aswan, at the first cataract of the Nile. From there, Rome looked south. Kush looked north. The negotiations over the southern border did not go smoothly. Rome attempted to impose tribute. Kush refused. And then, while the Roman garrison was temporarily reduced, its soldiers pulled north for a campaign elsewhere. Kush moved. The army that marched on the Roman positions was led not by a king, but by a queen. Her name was Amanirenas. She held the title Kandake, a Kushite royal title that Greek and Roman writers often rendered as Candace. In the Meroitic period, some women who bore this title ruled with exceptional public authority, commanding armies, conducting diplomacy, appearing on temple walls in the same scale and posture as the kings beside them, sometimes larger. A stele found at Hammadab, near Meroë, mentions Amanirenas alongside a co-ruler in the context of what appears to be the Roman War. The full picture of her authority is assembled from multiple sources, each with its own perspective and agenda. What the archaeological record confirms is this. Amanirenas was described in ancient sources as a fierce woman who had lost one eye. She led her forces north, struck the Roman positions hard, sacked Cyano and 2 neighboring settlements, and, in a gesture that has survived in the archaeological record, carried back to Meroë a bronze head of the Emperor Augustus. Not as a trophy exactly, as an insult, delivered in bronze and permanent. The head was buried beneath the entrance to a victory temple at Meroë, deliberately placed so that everyone who entered, every worshipper, every soldier, every visitor, would walk over the face of Rome's emperor with every step. That head was excavated in 1910. It is now in the British Museum. And it is one of the most striking surviving bronze portraits of Augustus anywhere in the ancient world, preserved not by Rome, but by the civilization that buried it in the dirt as an act of contempt. Rome responded with force. A general named Petronius led 2 campaigns south, pushed Kush back, and sacked Napata. The losses were real, but Petronius could not hold the territory. The logistics of occupying the deep Sudan were beyond even Rome's capacity. What followed was negotiation. The peace concluded around 21 or 20 before the Common Era was, by the standards of what Rome usually offered to kingdoms it had just fought, remarkably favorable to Kush. The tribute demands were dropped. The border was set. Kush did not become a Roman province, it kept its independence. The Kandake tradition Amanirenas represented was not unique to her. Multiple women held royal authority at Meroë across the Meroitic period, their names appearing on temple walls, stelae, and royal inscriptions. They are depicted in a distinctly Kushite artistic style, one that had absorbed Egyptian conventions and then deliberately departed from them, showing these figures as powerful, imposing, armored. Not copies of Egyptian queens. Something different, something that had decided what it wanted to be. The religious landscape of Meroë makes the same statement even more clearly. In the Napatan period, official Kushite royal religion spoke heavily through Egyptian sacred forms, Amun above all. But as Kush moved south and became more deeply itself, indigenous Kushite deities entered the monumental language of kingship more visibly than they ever had before. The most important of them was Apetamak. Apetamak was a lion-headed war god, fierce, protective, unmistakably Meroitic. There was no simple Egyptian equivalent. His cult centers stood at Naka and Musawarat es Sufra, ceremonial sites in the landscape south of Meroë, whose scale and complexity show how far Kushite religion had moved beyond the adoption of Egyptian forms. At Naka, the Lion Temple was commissioned in the 1st century of the Common Era by King Natakamani and Queen Amanitore. On its walls, the royal pair appear with the visual authority of rulers. The Egyptian grammar of power is still visible in the stance and symmetry, but the result is no longer Egyptian. The language has changed accent. It has changed body. It has changed God. And then there was Musawarat es Sufra. Its great enclosure is one of the strangest and most debated monuments in the entire Nile Valley. Ramps, courtyards, corridors, temples, walled spaces, and carved animals, especially elephants. Scholars have proposed different functions across generations of study: a pilgrimage center, a royal retreat, a ritual complex, perhaps connected to elephants in ceremonial or military life. The safest answer is also the most honest. We do not fully know. But that uncertainty is itself useful. It reminds us that Meroë was not a faded afterimage of Egypt. It had sacred landscapes whose meanings do not translate easily into Egyptian categories. It built things that do not look like anything else along the Nile. The pyramids of Meroë make the same statement in stone. Across the Kushite pyramid fields of Sudan, at El Kuru, at Nuri, at Gebel Barkal, at Meroë itself, more than 250 pyramids are known. In total, they outnumber the pyramids of Egypt. They are not the same as the Egyptian originals. They are steeper, narrower, built at a sharper angle, with small attached mortuary chapels at their bases, decorated with carved reliefs. Smaller in individual scale, but more numerous, more densely clustered, and in their ensemble forming a royal landscape unlike anything else in the ancient world. One of the most notorious European visitors to those pyramid fields was an Italian adventurer named Giuseppe Ferlini. In 1834, searching for treasure, he damaged dozens of pyramids, demolishing their tops, in some cases using explosives, in a search for buried gold. He found jewelry in one. He found rubble in the rest. The pyramids he targeted had been found in good condition just a few years earlier, documented by the French explorer Frédéric Calliot, who had published illustrated accounts of the site in the 1820s. Ferlini left them broken. The damage is still visible today. What no act of destruction could touch was what the pyramids represented, a civilization that had decided, across centuries, to keep building in a particular way. To mark its dead with monuments that echoed a deep tradition, that referenced Egypt without being subordinate to it, that accumulated into a royal landscape that said, simply and permanently, "We were here, we endured, this was ours." For roughly 1,000 years after losing Egypt, and for roughly 6 or 7 centuries after Meroë became its principal southern center, Kush continued to build, trade, rule, fight Rome, and leave its mark on the Nile Valley in stone and iron and the bones of the dead. 1,000 years. When people say Kush was a footnote to Egypt, they are not describing history. They are describing what happened to history after the fact. Who got remembered, who got studied, whose name ended up in the textbooks, and whose did not. But there is one more dimension to what Kush built at Meroë, one that goes beyond the pyramids and the trade routes and the warrior queens. Kush found its own voice and left it behind in a script that the world is still learning to hear. Every great civilization leaves behind a record of itself. Egypt left thousands of years of hieroglyphic inscription, on temple walls, on papyrus, on the objects buried with its dead. Mesopotamia left hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. Greece left philosophy, poetry, history, drama. Rome left law, engineering, and an administrative record so dense that historians are still working through it. Kush left something different. Kush left a script that the world spent over a century learning to sound out, and is still learning to understand. Meroitic is one of Africa's earliest indigenous writing systems after the Egyptian scripts, and the first script created specifically for the language of Kush itself. It appears on temple walls, on royal stelae, on offering tables, on small personal objects buried with the dead. It was used for roughly 600 years, from around the 3rd century before the Common Era until the kingdom's end in the 4th century of the Common Era. And then it stopped being used, and the knowledge of how to read it, whatever community of scribes and priests and scholars had carried that knowledge, dissolved with the kingdom that had produced it. For well over 1,000 years, the inscriptions were simply there, carved in stone, some of them remarkably well preserved by the dry desert air, unreadable. The first step toward reading them came through the work of a British Egyptologist named Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who published his phonetic decipherment of the script in 1909 and 1911. He compared Meroitic inscriptions with Egyptian demotic texts, looking for names, titles, and ritual phrases that appeared in both, and gradually worked out the sound values of the Meroitic signs. This was a genuine breakthrough. After Griffith's work, scholars could read the script aloud. They could sound out the words. But sounding out words is not the same as understanding them. The problem Griffith's decipherment revealed, rather than solved, is that Meroitic is not closely related to any language scholars already knew. It is not Egyptian. It is not related to the Semitic languages of the ancient Near East. Many specialists associate it with northeastern African language families, but the evidence remains difficult because the language is so poorly understood. The sounds are known. The grammar is partially reconstructed. Some vocabulary has been identified: royal titles, names of gods, funerary phrases that appear repeatedly in burial inscriptions and whose meaning can be inferred from context. But the deeper content remains largely inaccessible. What scholars have is roughly analogous to being able to read the sounds of a language you do not speak. You could pick up a book written in Finnish, apply phonetic rules, and read every word aloud correctly, and understand almost none of it. That is the situation with Meroitic. And it helps to understand what the surviving Meroitic record actually is. It is not one library waiting to be opened. It is scattered across monuments, offering tables, funerary inscriptions, temple walls, stelae, graffiti, and small objects. Many texts are short. Many are formulaic. They repeat names, titles, offerings, and ritual language. That repetition helps scholars identify patterns, but it also limits how much meaning can be extracted from what survives. A long historical chronicle would be different. A diplomatic treaty would be different. A bilingual royal decree would be different. If a text like that exists somewhere under the sand, Meroitic beside Greek or Demotic or another known language, it could change the field overnight. What would unlock Meroitic is what unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics, a bilingual text, a long inscription in Meroitic alongside a translation in a known language, a Rosetta Stone for Kush's own script. So far, no such text has been found. There are short bilingual fragments, brief inscriptions in Greek and Meroitic on the same object, enough to confirm a few names and titles, but not enough to reconstruct vocabulary at any scale. There are inscriptions in Egyptian Demotic that reference some of the same events or rulers, but nothing long enough, nothing rich enough in shared content to give scholars the foothold they need to move from phonetics into meaning. The search continues. In recent years, computational and statistical approaches have entered the field. Researchers have applied these methods to the corpus of known Meroitic inscriptions, looking for patterns, repeated sequences, and structural regularities that might reveal grammatical rules or word boundaries more clearly than manual analysis could. Some progress has been made in understanding Meroitic grammar. But these tools face a hard limit. Without a bilingual anchor, they can map the structure of the unknown, but they cannot unlock its meaning. The bilingual text is still missing. What this means in practice is that Kush left parts of its own memory in writing: names, titles, rituals, royal claims, sacred formulas, and perhaps more. But we cannot yet read most of it. The voice is there, carved in stone, preserved by the desert for 2,000 years, waiting. There is something fitting about this that goes beyond irony. Egypt's record survived in part because Rome was fascinated by it, because Greek scholars studied it, because later empires preserved it, because the hieroglyphic system was eventually decoded by the same colonial-era scholarship that first misidentified Kerma as an Egyptian outpost. Egypt's history was written down, translated, published, displayed in museums, taught in schools. Kush's history, in its own voice, is still waiting for the world to be ready to listen. The script does not feel, looking at it, like the work of a civilization that thought it was building something temporary. The inscriptions are formal and deliberate. They follow conventions maintained across centuries. They appear on royal monuments meant to last. Whoever carved them believed they were saying something that mattered. They believed that someone, someday, would read it. We are still working on it. Kingdoms do not usually end on a single day. They thin out, they contract, they lose the capacity to do what they once did, to project power, to hold territory, to feed their cities, to maintain the ceremonies that told everyone inside the kingdom that the order of things was still intact. Kush ended the way most kingdoms end, slowly, then all at once. The pressures that accumulated against Meroë in its final centuries were multiple and are not fully understood. Scholars are honest about this. The evidence is fragmentary, and the temptation to impose a clean narrative of cause and effect onto a process that was probably messy and gradual should be resisted. What the evidence does suggest is this. The land around Meroë may have been under environmental pressure for a long time. The iron furnaces that had made the city rich required enormous quantities of hardwood to fire them, and the forests of the upper Nile Valley, already not vast, may have been steadily depleted. What had once been productive agricultural land may have shown signs of degradation. The climate across the region appears to have shifted in ways that reduced rainfall and stressed the food systems supporting a large urban population. These are hypotheses supported by the archaeological evidence, not certainties. The picture points toward environmental stress. It does not deliver a clean verdict. The trade routes were shifting as well. The rise of the Aksumite kingdom, centered in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, gave Red Sea merchants an alternative corridor that may have diverted some commerce away from Meroë. Goods that had once flowed through Kush may have begun flowing around it. The revenues that had funded temples and armies and royal tombs may have begun to thin. And then there was Aksum itself. By the early 4th century of the Common Era, Aksum had become one of the most powerful states in the region. Rich from Red Sea trade, politically sophisticated, militarily capable. Its king, Ezana, left behind inscriptions describing campaigns into the Nile Valley. The exact nature of the Aksumite intervention in Meroë's collapse is debated. A trilingual stele attributed to Ezana describes military activity in the region, but scholars disagree about whether it describes an actual sack of Meroë or operations in the surrounding area. Aksum likely intervened in an already weakened landscape, rather than delivering a single decisive blow. What is clear is that by around 350 of the Common Era, Meroë was no longer functioning as a royal capital. The pyramid burials had stopped. The inscriptions had stopped. The city was emptying, or already empty. The kingdom of Kush, after more than 1,000 years in various forms, was over. What followed was not memory, not immediately. The people who had lived in the Nile Valley between the 1st and 6th cataracts did not vanish. They continued, farming, trading, building in smaller ways, absorbing new influences from Aksum, and later from the spread of Christianity and then Islam through the region. But the specific political and cultural tradition that had been Kush the royal ideology, the pyramid burials, the Meroitic script, the Amun temples, dissolved without being passed on in recognizable form. For well over 1,000 years, the ruins sat in the desert, and no one outside the region paid them much attention. The pyramids of Meroë were not unknown to the medieval Islamic scholars who traveled and wrote about northeastern Africa, but they were not studied. The inscriptions were not read. The names of the kings and queens carved into the temple walls were not names anyone recognized or tried to recover. European documentation began in earnest only in the 19th century, and, as we have already seen, what that scholarship first brought to the task was a set of assumptions that took decades to correct. The correction is ongoing. Today, the archaeological sites of the island of Meroë are designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, encompassing the pyramid fields, the royal city, and the ceremonial complexes at Naka and Musawarat es Sufra, recognized formally as part of the heritage of humanity. Sudanese archaeologists and the region's modern custodians and inheritors of this heritage are increasingly central to the work of excavation and preservation, a shift that matters not only practically but symbolically. The story of Kush is being recovered, slowly, by those with the deepest stake in recovering it. But that recovery faces a threat that has nothing to do with the passage of time or the fragility of ancient stone. Sudan has been torn by conflict, devastating and ongoing. In 2024, UNESCO issued formal warnings about military activity near the island of Meroë World Heritage Site and raised alarms about the risk of looting and damage to Sudanese museums and heritage institutions. The pyramids of Meroë, the cemeteries of Kerma, the temples of Napata. They survived 2,000 years of desert silence and are now threatened by something far more immediate. This, too, is part of Kush's story, not the ancient part, the present one. What Kush left behind, across all of it, is more than ruins. It left a model of what a civilization can be when it refuses to be defined by someone else's idea of what it should be. Kush looked at Egypt, the dominant cultural and religious power in its world, and absorbed what was meaningful, adapted what was useful, and eventually departed from it entirely to build something unmistakably its own. It looked at Rome, the greatest military power in the world it later inhabited, and fought it, negotiated with it, and maintained its independence against it. It did not survive forever. Nothing does. But it survived longer than most, and it did so on its own terms. The pyramids still stand in the desert, steep and narrow, their tops broken in some cases by the man who demolished them. Looking for gold, he mostly did not find. They stand in clusters, closer together than Egyptian pyramids, more numerous, less famous. Most people who know about pyramids do not know these exist. That is the whole story, in a way. Across Sudan, Kushite pyramid fields came to outnumber Egypt's, a civilization that conquered Egypt and ruled it for a century. That fought Rome and secured its independence. That wrote in its own script, a script whose signs can be sounded out, but whose language still gives up its meanings slowly, still keeping some of its silence. Kush was not Egypt's shadow. Egypt was Kush's door. And beyond that door was a kingdom that lasted 1,000 years, left its mark across the ancient world, and is still, slowly, carefully, against considerable odds, being returned to the history it always deserved. Thank you for drifting with us tonight. New journeys every week.